the first time I surfaced after his death, I had friends that came and stayed with me, and I thank them to this day. I had 3 or 4 of my closest girlfriends stayed for a week with us after he died. And so sometime during that week, I think it was after the funeral, but before the burial, I finally got out to like I just had to get out of my house. There were so many people, and I needed a morning to myself. And I went to the bookstore. I said, there has to be a book that will teach me how do I survive this? How do I help my kids? Here I am, right, with a background in child development, child trauma. I have a trauma counseling certificate. I knew things, but I didn't feel like I knew enough.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Today, I'm chatting with Jeanette Koncikowski. She has dedicated her career to helping survivors of trauma heal and thrive while teaching others how to support them best. She has a background in psychology, education, and community development, and working now as a consultant and grief coach. She is a mother. She is a widower, and we'll be talking about that. I say was, I guess. Currently, we will find out where your journey is. But this journey of this conversation will be about widowhood and that journey in your life. So welcome, Jeanette.
Thank you so much for having me, Kendra.
I'm glad you are here. And as we were just chatting a little bit beforehand, we'll see where our conversation goes. So right now you are currently living, are you still in the Massachusetts area, or do you live, and I know in the
I'm in New
book,
York now.
you're in New York. Okay.
In New York.
In New York. So you are a mom and a therapist, and that journey of even becoming a therapist, you were married to your high school sweetheart, Mark, and that was kind of what took you on to going to together, right? As a family, you guys
Yes.
went to the Boston area while you were getting
Yeah,
your.
for a brief period of
Do you
time.
do you want to flaunt where
Sure.
you went to school?
I was very privileged to get into Harvard for graduate school. So I'm from Buffalo, back in Buffalo, New York now, just outside the city. But Mark and I, my first husband, had an opportunity to live in Boston for a few years when I got into grad school at Harvard. And then we stayed in the area for a little bit and then came back here before our first daughter was born.
Yes, well, thank you. Now you're a mama, well, no longer a teenager. Your oldest is no longer a teenager. You already passed one teenage year. You
Right,
still
right.
have one teenager at home, and that's a whole other journey in itself of
Yes,
being.
yeah. It's like a half empty nest right now. I've got a almost 20-year-old. My oldest Grace is going to be 20 in April, and my youngest Milo is turning 16 in 2 weeks. So
Ooh,
they're not that little anymore.
yeah,
When I started the book, they were young.
yeah, and that's at the time of this
Yeah,
recording,
sorry.
by the way, because it might not record till it will launch a little further back. So as we're speaking, they're about to be that age. Now, Jeanette, tell us about the background. You had experienced grief already in your life when before Mark's passing. But so tell us your journey, your grief journey when you're first in your marriage. You guys got married. Mark had some mental health issues all your life and his life and all of his life. So tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so I met Mark when I was 15, my first day of sophomore year of high school, and
En clase de
we,
español. En
yeah.
clase de español.
In Spanish class. He was sitting next to me in Spanish class, and just we were together for 21 years after that. So fell in love with him. Um, he had both of us had struggles as teenagers with our mental health. I had pretty severe anxiety. He had depression. And so, when you meet as teenagers with those kinds of things, right, it's like, oh, my person, my mirror, they see me, they know what this is like when you're an angsty teen. And so we were pretty inseparable. After, uh, we went through some stuff in high school, right after high school, right before the end of high school, his depression got severe enough where he had to be hospitalized. And then a few months later, less than a year later, his mother passed away suddenly in our first year in college. And that obviously took, that grief and his family going through that took a toll on him. And then at the same time, right around not too much longer, my mother got diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer. And so as teenagers, even, we were dealing with a lot of
Heavy,
health
heavy.
issues,
Yeah.
crises, heavy things. And so when I got into Harvard for graduate school, it was kind of this opportunity for us we saw it as an opportunity to start over. My mom survived at that point and didn't want me to not have that opportunity, even though she was going through chemo while I was there. And so we picked up our lives in Buffalo, and at 22 we moved to Boston. And we had some good years. His depression was kind of always this specter that accompanied us. It would be there, sometimes very aggressively, sometimes more in the background. We developed a very codependent relationship on each other, I think, because of not having as much family support as we needed, because our families were dealing with all these other things, and really grew up together. I didn't know how to be an adult without him. And so, we came back to Buffalo and got married. We had our first daughter in 2005 and went through some infertility struggles, and then had our second daughter in 2009. And throughout all of that, we maintained our relationship, but it was a struggle. He went back to school. He became a chiropractor. And right around that time, things, his depression just wasn't abating. Over the years, we tried therapy, medication, yoga, Reiki, all the things you could think of to try to get him help. And nothing ever stuck, nothing ever worked. And it was kind of this mystery. And it got to a point with him where, his depression could be very much weaponized against me, where it really became unhealthy in our relationship. And we got to a point around 2012. I was just, the life crises kind of continued. My mother's cancer came back and was metastatic. And so she was terminally ill. Um, we had lost a baby, our third pregnancy, we lost in the second term. And so I had just had a miscarriage. My mother was dying. I was immersed in my own grief, and our marriage started to fall apart. And in the middle of that all, within a year after my mother's death, my best friend died. And so suddenly of a heart attack at 37. And so there was just, again, crisis after crisis after crisis, grief after grief after grief. And for me, it was very much, those three deaths, the loss of our pregnancy, my mother's death, my best friend. It really made me start questioning, like, well, who am I and how much time do I have? And do I want to be this unhappy? Like, I love this man. I loved him more than I've ever loved anyone. And we were not in a healthy marriage. And it wasn't healthy for our children to see us the way we were. And so I made a very difficult decision to leave, to separate. We were separated for 13 months. And he kind of hit rock bottom during that time. He needed to hit rock bottom in order to kind of rebuild. And the first 6 months we were separated were terrible. And then gradually it started to get better. The other thing that happened in the middle of all of this is he got an answer to his depression. He was diagnosed with epilepsy. So literally the week my mother died, we got the call from the doctor because he had been having these episodes that we thought were high blood pressure related, where he would pass out, and he turned out to be drop seizures. So again, all this is happening at the same time, right? Like all of that grief, the illnesses, the depression, our marriage problems. And so I stayed for a while because I felt like, who leaves their partner when they're newly diagnosed, and then we just couldn't sustain it. So the separation was good for us, though. I think both of us felt like it was a much needed break, and we had just started working on getting back together, going to counseling, spending time as a family. I had hope, he had hope that our marriage was going to survive this time apart. And then he suddenly died. And so it was just at that cusp of like reuniting that everything shifted again in my life.
Yeah, that is a lot that you went through in such a short period of time and in a young life. As I was reading your book, which by the way, I didn't mention that as I was in saying your whole resume, she's an author. Shipwrecked is the name of her book, and the story behind Shipwrecked. Do you want to say why it is you chose that title?
Yeah. So when he died, that's what it felt like to me. It felt like this life we had planned, right, just got destroyed. And he went overboard, and I wanted to go overboard too, right? Like when you're in that deep, deep grief, because of course I blame myself. He died alone in the apartment. I found him. And so the feeling for me of like, I can't live without this person. I can't, I'm going to drown. And so shipwreck really became this metaphor for me throughout my grief of like, this was the experience. It was like, I'm drowning. I've lost you. Our whole life is shattered. How am I supposed to go on? And then having to make a very conscious decision to get to the surface, right? To find that light, that little bit of hope, and get to the surface. And then you look around and you see everything that was in your life is just now floating in the water, right? Like your whole life you had was destroyed by the loss. And so, then there's nothing to do but get to shore. So it felt like just for the next 18 months dragging myself and my kids to shore. And then you get to a place of hope and you think, okay, like I'm going to find other people on this island I made it to. And then it turns out to be deserted. And all the
Like the
people you thought were going to be there for you are
or
not, in
not?
fact, there for you
Mm.
in your grief. But you do find others. You kind of find your tribe. And there was a period of rebuilding. And then for me, there was very much, and this took years, but there was a decision to go back into the water, to set sail again in my life, and to make a decision to move forward without him and to return to the water's edge. And so that's kind of the metaphor I weave in the book, in part my story, but in part also my research with other widow parents, and very practical suggestions for how you cope with such a loss. Our story was very unique and we had these other layers in it, right? A lot of widow and widowers I've worked with over the years. So it's been 10 plus years now. It's been a whole decade without him. I was 36 when I lost him. I'm 46 now. And it was really this recognition of like, you will have another life. And I would have punched you if you told me that when I was 3 months into my grief. So it's like, it's so hard to see the trajectory, that there is a compass, that there is a place to navigate to when you are in deep grief. And that grief lasted, and still, I mean, it's not like it's left me. It's just different now.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and the little nuance about why you that the Family Robinson that you said that
Yes.
that was one of the books
Yeah, the
that
Swiss Family Robinson. It was
Family
one of the books
Robinson,
that
and so that's
made
kind
me
of
really think about that.
what you guys were on this island were like the Family Robinson
Yeah.
um,
You really have to like look for, the little
resourceful.
bits of resources that
Yeah,
you can have to get through this time with your mental health intact.
it's such a good metaphor of that, a metaphor for grief, because when I have this, when I interview people, it's really like, what tools did you use and what helped you? And this podcast itself is a tool. Now, is every single tool that's out there for grieving people the ones that everybody's going to use? No, they're there in case that ends up being a fit. Just like if you're on an island, not every single thing is going to be something that you might use. You might want to make your hut out of, I don't know, palm leaves and somebody else may want to make it out of stone. I'm not sure, like whatever, right? So you have to see what works for you in your grief journey, and that's what you have. And your chapters, you share your story, and then at the end, they're very concise, helpful tools that have helped you, because I know that we all are seeking for this manual. Like you even said yourself, you're trying to find exactly out there what was there when you were a widow. Like what is out there? What can I use? And you're picking books up and nothing really fit what you were going through. And so we write or we share what has worked for us in case that's something that may be helpful for somebody else. So in this process of writing, when did it start? When did you start writing your
It
book?
was
So it's been 10 years of his passing.
it's been
When did
10
you start
years,
writing?
about 2 years after his death. Originally, I was asked to write. I was asked to write a sermon for my church. So at the time, I was a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church here, and one of the things that's different about the UU faith is that they have lay ministers, and everyday people come up and share their stories. You don't have to be, the priest with the homily. You all have lessons to share with each other. And so my church had asked if, kind of knowing I was going through this journey, if I would be interested in sharing a little bit of the story. And so I wrote a sermon. Um, that stayed in the book. It's part of the book, about my experience. 2 weeks after he died, we were stuck in a snowstorm, and we were trapped in our house for 5 days. So it was just, my 30s were real rough. It was a real rough time, and I wrote this sermon about it was during the snowstorm that I made this decision to begin again. And so I had this essay that was my sermon, and it was after I wrote that, it was so helpful for me to like just get it out. And I'm a writer by trade. So I was a therapist early in my career, and then I moved into education, and I have been writing curriculum for 20 years for different training programs, to support caseworkers and social workers and psychologists. And so I was a writer, but it was this very technical writing. I didn't do a lot of creative writing. And so getting my story out, being able to share our experiences, um, that was really the first time I started writing our story. But it was even further back than that. The first time I surfaced after his death, I had friends that came and stayed with me, and I thank them to this day. I had 3 or 4 of my closest girlfriends stayed for a week with us after he died. And so sometime during that week, I think it was after the funeral, but before the burial, I finally got out to I just had to get out of my house. There were so many people, and I needed a morning to myself. And I went to the bookstore. I said, there has to be a book that will teach me how do I survive this? How do I help my kids? Here I am, right, with a background in child development, child trauma. I have a trauma counseling certificate. I knew things, but I didn't feel like I knew enough. And I didn't know what this experience would be like. And I didn't even know if I could call myself a widow if we were separated. And so I went to the bookstore looking for a book, and I couldn't find this book I wanted, which was a handbook that would help me, inform me, how do I get through this as a young widowed mother? And so the idea of the book started then. And about 2 years later, so I wrote the sermon. And then I said to myself, Jeanette, you are a researcher, you are a writer, you have had all of this trauma, you understand trauma from a theoretical point of view. Maybe you do have something to share with the world. And so that actually led me to begin wanting to connect with other young widowed parents. So the first thing I did is I started a Facebook group called Widow Parent Project, which still exists 10 years later. And I wanted to connect with other widowed parents to hear their stories. And I thought I would write a book that was research based about, what I learned from other widowed parents. And so I met through the internet all of these other widowed parents. They beautifully shared their stories with me. That was going to be the original book. I have all their stories. The first book I wrote that took 8 years, was my story, but it was also all their stories. And it was too big. It was like 400 pages.
Well, then
So
we can say shipwreck one, shipwreck two,
shipwreck
shipwreck
one,
three.
pretty much. And so when my editor read it, first thing she said is, people with grief cannot handle all this content. This is way too much. Like, you should have known that. I'm like, yeah, you're right. So I think I actually have two books. So I was not going to publish this as a memoir. I didn't feel like my story was worthy enough of being told or being centered. I wanted to highlight the other parents who had shared so much of their stories with me. And when people read it, the thing that they kept coming back to was my story and saying, but your story is worthy. And actually, there's a lot of lessons here. So Shipwrecked, it's a memoir of widow parenting and life after loss. That's my first book. And now I'm working on the second book, which is Stronger Than the Storm, which is more of a kind of the guidebook or handbook I want it, right, from other widowed parents' stories. So I have both. Not making as much progress on Stronger Than the Storm as I would like because I need to find time to write. And it's really hard with everything else going on to find that time. So Shipwrecked took me 8 years. So I started it 2 years after he died. I just published it in 2024. And it was 8 years to get it from start to finish. But I'm really proud of it. And I'm so grateful to the 30 plus parents I interviewed that shared their stories of loss with me and let me kind of hold that. And hopefully will come out someday as the second part of this book series.
Yeah. And what a way to honor Mark by having it be on his 10th year anniversary then in
Yeah,
2024,
it
right?
worked out that way. I got to a place around year 7 where I was having a hard time finishing the book. And my therapist said to me, maybe you don't want to finish this book because you're not ready to let go of his story. And that really hit. I was really struggling to finish the book. I had a lot of anxiety about how Mark would be perceived. Like, did I have a right to even share his story? Did I have a right to tell the truth about our marriage and the good, the bad, and the ugly? There was a lot of good, and there was some ugly, and there was some bad things, right? And I felt like, who am I to share this? And then it was Mark, my memories of Mark. Mark was a writer, and that was his phrase. He would always say, like Jack Kerouac said, you have to write the good, the bad, and the ugly. And once I kind of settled on the fact that I think he would have been actually proud of me for writing this, and that his story is just a story now to share, and our story is a story to share, right? That I want to help other families. And I think maybe these are lessons I could have learned earlier in my life that would have spared us some pain. But I wanted to be able to share what our experiences were. And my children, my beautiful children, also, graciously let me include their stories. I said to them at one point, like, I can just leave you out, right? This can be my story. And they were like, but it's our story. And so both kids let me interview them in the book. And, I think one of the things that makes Shipwrecked unique is that we meet them when they're 5 and 9. And then I interview them when they are 12 and 17. And to see for the children the progression of their grief and what that's looked like as our lives have changed, right? I've had a lot of people that have read Shipwreck say that that was a really important piece to include because we often don't get to hear children's experience of grief over time.
And that is so valuable what you just shared because it is true that a lot of times kids, like the parent themselves is grieving so much that the kids end up getting lost in this mix, like as if their grief is not sometimes valid in that process as much as the parent, a lot of times. So, I mean, it happens in other type of dynamics too, like siblings when a parent die, if a sibling dies, then the other siblings are kind of like that's happened. That was my first, like core family experience was my sister dying, and that kind of thing of like, wait, but I'm still here too. Or people
Right,
are like, or people, oh my gosh, your parents, they must feel, and then they're like, yeah, and like, what
right.
about us? Like,
Yeah,
those kind of
that's a
things.
really, I'm sorry you went through that. It's a very common issue in that family dynamic of sibling loss. And I think, you know, people read the book, they'll see it in the story, right? My kids' experience of grief was very different. And I think that's another major takeaway for me of what I learned, right? Is just because we're the same family, everybody's grief was different and the way it showed up, the things we needed in our grief, the way it still impacts us. everybody had a very unique experience of grief. And the hardest thing for me as a parent was to, especially, being a helping professional, it was like, I just want to fix this. I wanted to make it, quote, right. And there is no fixing grief. And I can give them skills and tools and resources and the best therapist in town, and they still have to go through their grief is their own unique individual experience. All I can do is bear witness to it and be there for them. And that was really, really hard lesson for me because I wanted to make it better.
That that right there, what you said is so important because people are trying to find like we find the manual. Okay, this is how we go through it. But then you're like, okay, and then the last step, okay, am I supposed to already be done then with it
Right, right,
when
right.
you get to as and you mentioned about the steps, Kugler Ross's book, as well as then other ways that worked best for like that, not that worked best for you, but at least that the idea of what grief looked like being, the pebble in a jar. Tom's Leo.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I just forgot the
Lois Tonkin.
Lois. Thank you, Lois Tomkin. Um, that analogy of it, us growing around it. We grow. The grief is there, but we grow around it, and therefore it doesn't end up feeling the same way because we've grown, right, and who we've become. So anyhow, there's just so much in the book that everyone can take something from that. The part I wanted to share is, can we go a little bit over some of these helpful tips that you shared? So how about we do the ones, as we're talking about your kids, if we talk about the chapter in which at the end you talk about how to support children with grief over time. So you have eight things that you've listed at the end of that particular chapter. Which how like for example with yours, let's start with seeking professional help. How and when did you start seeking professional help for the
Yeah.
kids?
So I actually, I guess one of the blessings, there were blessings, they were hard to find in the beginning, but one of the blessings of our experience was that I was a professional in this area, right? I was working in the field of child welfare at the time of his death, and I knew from my own school, I knew trauma therapist. And so I actually reached out. Well, I should say, even before that, the day he died, when we called the school to tell them that the children wouldn't be in that day, bless their heart, the school psychologist, social worker, and principal walked to my house and spent the day with us. So even the day of our loss, we had professionals with us. And I was so grateful for that.
I
They
want to
were
move to your
there.
school system. Where is your
It was great. I mean, they
That's
did. I was shocked that
amazing.
they just like we got home that morning a couple hours later, and there's these people waiting in my driveway, and they
Beautiful.
just surrounded us immediately. So we had that support on the immediate outset, and then you know because the children were with me when I found him, they had an added trauma component, right? So every child that experiences parental loss, it's traumatic. And then the kids, the way he died, and the children being with me, he died from sudden unexplained death and epilepsy. So the epilepsy actually contributed to his death. He had had a seizure and just didn't wake up from it. And so, that was an added trauma component. So I knew as a professional that they might need like psychological first aid. And so I had reached out to someone that had actually trained me when I was a student because I knew she was in private practice. I knew she was a trauma therapist. I was shocked when like the phone number I had scrawled on a notebook, she picked up, and I told her who I was and what we had just gone through. And she agreed to see the kids for an assessment. And agreed with my initial thinking that they were going to need some intensive therapy to help them process what had happened. And so we were able to. I was able to. I made a decision, even though money was going to be very tight. Even though we were faced with all of these financial decisions to make in the immediate aftermath of his death, that I wanted to prioritize our mental health. That was the most important thing for me after a trauma. Is like everything else has to stop and we have to be okay. We have to get to a place where our mental health is preserved so that this doesn't become maladaptive grief. And so I made the decision to, take whatever it was going to cost to get these kids help, to eventually get myself some help, although I put them first. And so we got into trauma counseling pretty quickly. I would say within about 2 months after he died, they started seeing somebody, each of them. My youngest was actually already in therapy because of the separation and some of the stress that had caused her. So she continued to work with that child psychologist. And then we have been in and out of therapy ever since. I've really tried to encourage my kids to see it as a tool that everybody should be able to access. And of course, we know therapy is not accessible for many people. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But I made the decision to get help early for them and to continue to use this resource as we've needed it. And that's looked different over the years, particularly because they've grown. Their grief is different at 5 and 9 than it was at 12 and 16 than it is at 16 and 20. So we got help early on. We also, about a year after, not quite a year after he died, we connected to our local bereavement center and we did a support group with other widowed moms and kids. And that was helpful in a different way because it also gave the children access to other kids like them. And I think that's an important part when you have child grief, that kids see themselves now as permanently different than every other kid, right? And so being able to meet other kids that had lost a parent was really helpful for them.
Yeah, peer-based support. So those two could either go hand in hand, or at times you might end up doing just one. But the main thing is that if you choose, or if you feel that type of support is needed in your situation, especially when it comes to a traumatic event in that grief journey, then definitely know
Yeah,
that that is
not
something.
everybody needs therapy
Correct.
for grief and loss. A lot of kids will do just fine
Hmm.
adapting. On the other side of it, I often will hear from parents in my support group with Widow Parent Project that I still run or that I've coached, where they wait too long, right? They wait until the child's behavior is so out of control with drinking, drug use in the teen years, or, with anger issues or behavioral issues, that now we're at a crisis, right? Something has happened at school, something has happened in the community. Now we're at a crisis. It's like, let's try to prevent that, right? So when you start to get those, like, oh, this doesn't feel really good anymore, or I'm starting to get worried about my kid, intervene then as opposed to waiting for something to
Hmm.
explode. So I always tell parents, like, not everybody needs therapy, but everybody does need some level of support. So figure out for you what that support looks like. Maybe it's a group. Maybe it's, a 6-week class on grief. Maybe
Hmm.
it's just having, you have a friend that went through something similar and you're spending more time together. We really looked at using all of those resources and tools to help us at various points in our journey.
And we're kind of just here talking. I'm not going to go like one, two, three
Yeah,
here on these, but the in that process, the part of keeping that communication open with your
right,
children throughout, not just the first weeks, not just the first year, just keeping it open years after.
right.
Because even as we say, if grief is there, just kind of we start changing
Right.
within that grief, then our children are too. So how did that look like when you would keep on,
Yeah.
talking to them?
This is the thing, right? We adapted, we coped, and we were still grieving. So, you have all these milestones that come every year, right? The anniversary of the death, his birthday, Father's Day, holidays. It's always with us. And so it's really important for parents with grieving children to not just think like, okay, we went through that, it's done, we've moved on with our life, right? They're okay. They never bring it up anymore. Well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't bring it up. I'll have a lot of parents be like, well, they're fine. My son's never wanted to talk with me about it again after the first year. But did he really? Or is it just that you weren't open to it? So I really encourage parents to have this be an ongoing conversation. So that to our family looks like, we just had my husband's Mark's birthday was February 9th. We're 10 years out. We had another snowstorm here. We did not get to the cemetery. We also were traveling back that day from seeing my oldest in college. And it was the first year we didn't do the thing we normally do, which is go out for his favorite food. And, so the conversation was, are we okay with that? Like, can we go later in the week, or do we need to do this ritual anymore? Like, let's just check in. How are we all feeling about this? Right. And each kid feels different. My oldest was not a fan of doing these kind of ritualistic things. She's like, she often wouldn't want to come to the cemetery. Well, I'm not going to force her to do that. So for her, right, she had a harder time processing it. It was like, she doesn't like these very big emotional displays. Okay, but I know she will call me when she needs to talk about her dad. And then for my youngest, she will want to accompany me to the cemetery. She will want to make sure we get Slurpees every year on his birthday and eat Five Guys burgers and fries, because that was his favorite thing. And so you really just have to have these. Sometimes it's the milestones that can be the opening. Sometimes it can be quieter. My youngest came to me a couple weeks before his birthday and said, it's almost February. And I knew exactly what she meant. It's almost his birthday. And I feel like it's hitting me hard. And it's 10 years. We all really, up to the 10th anniversary, it felt some kind of way this year. Um, and to the point you made earlier about it, it kind of worked out that it was in year 10 that I released the book. It felt like this milestone to me. And I really pushed myself to get the book published. I was like, that's it. 10 years is long enough. I gotta get it out this year. So I really think with parents, you just want to leave that door open from the day one. In the book, I write a little bit about, I don't even remember the first conversation I had with the kids about his death. It was so like I was so traumatized that day. I don't remember it, but I do remember we had multiple conversations. You have to keep talking about it, right? It doesn't go away, and pushing it down and pretending it's over doesn't work either.
hmm And within those conversations, that aspect of the either continuing that bond and the spiritual connection, that's one of the things you talk about too. Can you talk about what that was with you and the girls? Like what did that look
Yeah.
like in your life? And what kind of conversations did you have at those ages that they were at? that that they felt that they could kind of keep a connection and
Right.
based
So
on your
this
own
idea,
beliefs.
in grief theory, we call this continued bonds, right? It's really important for kids to have, after the death, to have a continued bond with that person. So just because their dad died doesn't mean that mark has left their memories, their spirits, their lives, their thoughts, and their heart. And so the way that we have kind of kept his spirit alive as our family has transitioned through this loss is really to find meaning in ritual. And so what that has looked like for us over the years has evolved. Um, in the very beginning, we would do
Was it the
things like,
Sunday fun day?
yeah, Sunday fun days, which was something him and I had started when we were separated to try to maintain being a family. And so they always joked that he was the silly one and I was the serious one. And I felt like, well, now I've got to fill these shoes, right? I've got to have fun with these kids. That's what they got from him. How am like, and I'm serious and now I'm grieving, but like, okay, let's go have fun on Sunday. Fine. It was like, so in the very beginning, that first year, I made it a point to have Sunday fun days. They continued even without him. And we wrote a bucket list of all the things that we thought he would want us to do or that we wanted to do in our life to honor him and remember him. And so we've done a lot of those things. They were little at the time. And so there was things like, I want to see Broadway and I want to get my ears pierced because daddy would think that was cool. And, little things that they've gone
Oh,
on.
I see.
We've done,
They were playing the
they were
daddy was
playing that
saying,
a little
they're
bit.
like,
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
dad would want me
My
to
dad
have
would want me
it.
to do this, mom. And then it was like
A
on the
tattoo, mom.
anniversary.
Dad would
Yeah.
like it.
Well, I got mine. I
You
got
got
my
yours. There
memorial
you go.
tattoos. That was one of my thing for him. And we did things like on the end. So he died the day before Halloween, and so like this weirdness of like planning a funeral right on Halloween, and um, we take pumpkins every year with little love letters that we've written in Sharpies on the pumpkins, and we leave them at his grave. And on his birthday, we have his favorite meal, and for 8 out of the last 10 years, I ran a memorial scholarship fund on his birthday. That was the kid's idea. And so, we have found ways, big ways and little ways. One of the things we always did with him around Halloween was, they would carve pumpkins, and they do that now with their stepfather. And so and my second husband is a widower. We met in a widow support group, and one of his traditions with his late wife was that they always cut down a Christmas tree. So we've maintained that in our blended family. So we find these ways of staying connected to the person we've lost, and that's even included other things like, the children have, when they were little, they had lockets that they wore. I gave them, after his memorial service, I gave them lockets with his picture. And when they got old enough to not lose them, I gave them lockets with his ashes in it. And so just these little ways, but that's been really meaningful for them. When I got remarried, we included in our service, Mark's picture and Leah's picture and my mother's picture, Brian's wife. We took pause to thank everyone that supported us in our loss, and we gave everyone a yellow rose at the ceremony and stopped the ceremony to thank those people that had supported us. And so, for me, it's really been about finding meaning and gratitude. And I think that's something, when you're deep in grief, it's hard to imagine having gratitude, right? And now on this other side of it, where I have this other life, the joy and the gratitude is a huge part of that, in finding ways to honor that, right? In doing fun things that Mark loved to do, like ride the mountain coaster. We did that for a long time every year. So it wasn't just the death, but about his life and about our lives and how we're going to live them going forward.
Yes, it's the a lot of times there's this misconception, and hence the name of this podcast, right? The grief, gratitude, and the gray in between. But that part that we think that it has to be either or. It's like you can't have joy and be grieving. No, yes, you can. You can have joyful, and you mentioned that finding
Yeah,
these moments of joy, finding these moments of gratitude, finding they can both coexist. Just like you and Brian love each other, yet you also still love Leah and Mark, and they are, and you still grieving them. It's those things can coexist. And this idea that we have in life that is like, oh my gosh, no, if I'm happy, then that means I'm not grieving. And then like all
right.
these guilt things that sometimes occur. It's like, it's just not, yeah, we want
No,
to
we try to put,
normalize.
like everything else, it's black and white. It's a binary. No, it's
No,
not. No, it's
no,
not. Like,
no.
I fell in love with someone in deep grief. We were both in deep grief, and we still fell in love with each other. And, um, I had a lot of guilt for falling in love with another man as I was grieving Mark. And I don't know if it would have been anyone else but Brian, because he understood what I was going through and I understood what he was going through. And so, these were the opportunities that came, that if you open yourself up, you can find joy even while you are grieving. And I think that was a huge takeaway for us, and something I didn't understand really about my life before. It's one of the really big ways that grief transformed me. I used to feel so unhappy in my life, and I didn't make enough time for myself, and I didn't make enough time to take care of me. It's part of what contributed to the issues in my first marriage. I really didn't create space for myself to have joy. And so that became part of my mission afterwards, was like, I get to be happy. I don't want to die unhappy. I've lost so many people I love, and they've had regret in their life about the things they didn't do. I don't want that to be me. And so one of the gifts I've gotten out of this was permission for myself to really live more fully and more courageously and do things I didn't think I could do, or would never have allowed myself or dared to do, because I know how short life is now. And I know that any minute you can lose it. And so why not live big, and why not live joyfully?
We should almost end it there, but I still have more for that was so perfect.
Thanks.
That is, yes, you can do both. You can have a fulfilling life amidst your grief. You can feel joy amidst your grief as well. And
But I think, if I could add one last thing on that,
yes,
you have to grieve though, right? Like, I
yes,
didn't
yes,
just
yes.
decide to be like, well, I'm
Amidst,
going to
yeah.
be happy and
No,
I'll
no,
be
no,
sad
no.
at the same time. There's a children's book, going on a bear hunt, right?
Oh,
They
yeah.
talk
We're
about the mud.
going
You
on a
have to
bear
go, yep, you have
through
to
it.
go, you can't go around it, you
Yeah.
can't go over it, you can't go under it, you
You have
have
to
to
go
go
through it.
through it.
Yeah.
And so the deeper you allow yourself to grieve, the more you let the feelings happen and you don't
Hmm.
numb them, you don't run from them, you don't hide from them. But the deeper you let yourself go into grief, that to me has equated to the deeper propensity I have for joy
Yes.
after the grief. So I don't want to give the idea it's just like, oh, I just, it's over. I'm not grieving anymore. You have to go through deep grief. My first years, 3, 4 years after he died, I was in deep, deep despair. And I was falling in love and I was rebuilding my life. But I let myself grieve him and all the other
Hmm.
losses. I really got to a place where I had to grieve everything that had changed my life.
It was such a short period because your mom died 2012,
Right.
and
Mark,
then
and then Tony,
Mark.
my friend Tony died, and then Mark died, and my marriage had ended in the middle of that. I had
Yeah,
a
and then you had a
miscarriage.
miscarriage. Yeah,
Right.
so a lot in a very short period of time. And you did mention, wasn't it Sophia?
Yes,
Sophia, wasn't
Sophia.
that also when Sophia died? That all of a sudden it's like that death opened up. This was your friend's
Yes.
wife, right? That, and then that ended up opening up the floodgates, as you say, for
Right.
this other grief. And so knowing that it may not, even if you're grief right now, you may think that the grief is completely up on the surface. It may not fully be, floodgates
Right. And
open
that was,
fully.
I got to a place where I had focused so much on the kids and I had, I was in year 7. I just gotten remarried. We were in the pandemic and I decided to go back to therapy because I thought I just needed to work on like being a better wife this time around. This was like my grief about the marriage, the first marriage. And I went in, met the trauma, and I said, I need someone with a trauma background because I have all this trauma, but like I've dealt with all of that. And she listened to my story and she was like, oh no, like I actually think you need to process all of this because even though you maybe tackled your mom's death and this little bit on the miscarriage, and then you went to therapy after Mark died, like the whole of it I hadn't dealt with. And the way it had really changed who I was and was impacting the core beliefs I had going into my second marriage, the way I felt, I hadn't really dealt with it. I had kind of did the thing professionals do, which is like, let me take care of everybody else. I'm just going to tamp this down. And like, I'm okay. I've dealt with the surface stress, the daily stress. I hadn't really dealt with my own grief. And I think that's also where I got stuck with writing the book. The book was a release for me in being able to tell the story and in grieving. And I had to go away to write a lot of it. I did these little mini retreats for a couple of days at a time because I had to grieve. And I wouldn't let myself do it fully with the kids. I would grieve to an extent. They would see my mourning, they would see the tears, but I needed to like go out to the woods and cry, And so in writing the book, I went out to the woods and I cried alone. And I had very deep grief 7, 8 years after his death that needed to come out.
I I love that you're saying that you really needed to grieve and that allowing that, because a lot of times people are very fearful of opening up that emotion because they don't know how they're going to put it back in. It's like, wait, it's like one of those jack in the boxes that
Right, right,
just like
right,
pops out and then you're like, wait, how do I stuff it back in there?
right, right.
So how, when you would have these weekend retreats to write and to grieve, what would be your process of like, was there even a process? I don't even think it's like, we don't even
Yeah, there's
logically
really
think it,
not,
right? It
I
isn't, right?
would start writing. I would have try to recreate, what had happened. And then sometimes I just had to sit like you see it on the page and you're like, damn, that was a lot, Jeanette. And then I would go take a walk and I would just let whatever feeling, thought, emotion, sensation came come. And often that meant I was on my knees crying in some woods in a beautiful retreat center somewhere, right? And I would let myself do it until I was exhausted, till it was out. And then I would pick myself back up and I would go in and I would put on a pot of soup or open up a bottle of wine and I would watch something on HBO for an hour and then I would come back to the book. And this is the process I had in writing, that the writing was grieving. The writing was a release. And I think when I got to the end, it was like, I have pushed this out of my body now. I have let it go into the universe, which doesn't mean I don't still grieve him, right? But this weight I was carrying of our story got out of me, and that was a really
Hmm.
important part of my healing.
Since you said a pot of soup, one of the analogies that for me always works and that when I talk to my clients, it's like a pressure cooker. You got to let the steam out. You have to. If not, it's just gonna
Right.
burst.
And I was
So,
very much like a little, let a little bit out, let a
yes.
little bit out, let a little bit out, but I'm fine. Worry about everybody else. And I had to get to a place. I ended up doing 2 years of intensive trauma therapy before I was really in a place where I felt like I have healed through all of the loss I've had.
Mhm. And healing, that word is something that sometimes when I hear, oh, healing, it's not like that it's over. It's just that you
Right.
have found a way of living with it in a way
Mhm.
that is manageable and doesn't disrupt your life. Right? Is that what you
Right.
see that
Yeah,
word
very
healing
much
in
that idea
therapy?
in the book with some of the grief theory I've shared, right, with Lois Tompkins, like you grow around your grief. And the healing for me was getting to a place where it's always there. It's always going to be a part of who I am, right? To one of the things you said early on in the interview, I'm always Mark's widow. I will all like that will I will always have that experience of being widowed, even though I'm remarried now. It doesn't cancel it out, right? It's
Hmm.
not like,
Hmm.
oh, now they put the boxes. Are you widowed? Are you married? Are you
You're
uh,
like, all of the
I'm like,
above.
check, check, check. Like, right? It's that binary. Everybody wants the like. I've had people say to me, "Well, you're remarried. Your second husband doesn't want you talking about your first husband." I'm like, "Well, he actually does. He encourages it, in fact, because we're healthy people. So,
Hmm.
right? Like this, you have to let the grief out. You have to um, move through it, and the healing for me, being healed, it's not an end state. It is a process. It's something I'm still losing a earbud, still really working on. And I don't, I think as long as I'm alive, Mark will live within me. Mark's story, who Mark was, will live in my children. And so, it's not like I'm over it. It's always with us. He's always with us. And I
His
hope
legacy continues. Yeah.
yeah, his legacy really does continue. And his legacy was not his death. His legacy was not his depression. Um, all the best parts of him are in our girls, and so I get to see them grow every day, and I'm grateful for that.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jeanette. Before we wrap up, is there anything that I have not asked you that you want to make sure that you share with the audience?
Yeah, the last thing I would say is, so one of the things I did when the book was released is I finally got Widow Parent Project up on the web. So I have a lot of resources for widow parents. You can find us online at widowedparentproject.com. Please feel free to go to that site, share those resources with young widowed people in your life. It was so hard to find people that were young widows. We joined a widow support group, and everyone was 60 and 70 years old. That's how I met Brian, because we were the only two in our 30s. And there were other women in their 40s and 50s, but there wasn't enough support for young widowed parents. And so I've wanted to write the book, and I wanted to create this website to give people places to go find that information I so desperately needed 10 years ago. And now we have so much more. I've been really pleased that in the last 10 years, there's podcasts, there's books, there's um, all kinds of other resources now that didn't exist when I was widowed. And so I'm really grateful for people like you that do this work, that share these stories, just to know you're not alone in it, and you can find community. And finding community is another really great resource to help. I would not be able to tell my story if my widowed friends had not reached for me in my grief and said, "We've got you, come along." And what I'm trying to do now is to pay that forward and say, "We've got you, come along. You can do this. You can do this."
That's perfect. Thank you, Jeanette.
Thank
Jeanette
you.
Kozowski. No, did I say it right?
Konzikowski.
Kozikowski. Oh,
It's
now
a
I
tough
got it.
one.
I mixed it with Mark with no, with Mike with the with the Monsters Inc. last name again, like we mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And again, her book Shipwrecked. You can find it anywhere. Is that right?
It's
Anywhere?
anywhere online, so you can get it through BookBaby. You can also get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and ask for it at your local library, and they'll have to get it too. So,
Perfect.
yeah,
And
it's
then you
Shipwrecked: A
mentioned
Memoir
your
of Widow Parenting.
And you mentioned then your website as well, and so many other ways as well that I'll link in the show notes. Thank you so much,
Thank
Jeanette,
you,
again,
Kendra.
for sharing your story, Mark's story, and the legacy lives on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.